The MERLIN project, for those of you who don't know what MERLIN is, mainstreaming ecological restoration of freshwater related ecosystems in the landscape context, innovation, upscaling, and transformation. And I will cover nearly all of those terms during my talk. But I'm going to speak today about my experience and what I think we're doing. So any mistakes or misquotes are mine alone. So what I'll talk about today very briefly from skimming those of you who have joined. There's some people here from within the MERLIN project, but many who are not. So I will very briefly talk about the project. Then I'll talk about what we mean by transformation, why we work with the sectors, which ones, what we've done, what we will do, and finish with some reflections. Astrid is our moderator. She will be keeping an eye on the chat. Please put any questions or comments in the chat as we go, and after about half an hour, there will be time for discussion. Okay, so the MERLIN project is often presented by our coordinators from University of Duisburg-Essen as bringing together top-down approaches and bottom-up approaches. And I'm associated with, if you like, the top-down approach, where we're looking at institutions and governance mechanisms across the whole of Europe, working with member state or EU level networks and associations, how we can make changes. But most of MERLIN is really focused on bottom-up learning from individual places doing best practice in restoration. So there are 18 case studies, and you can see them here, scattered across Europe. I'll explain what the colors mean. So the colors are related to a cluster around peatlands and wetlands, small streams and basins, and large transboundary rivers. And if you're interested in what we're doing, what kind of best practice we're looking at in terms of restoration, there is a range of interventions that are being trailed, but it's often in the peatlands and wetlands around rewetting and restoring the function of those habitats. In the small streams and basins, it's a mix between things like buffer strips and flowering meadows on these dikes or buffer strips to perhaps some in-stream naturalization or removing small barriers. And in the large transboundary rivers, it tends to be more focused on removing grey infrastructure associated with water supply or navigation or reclaiming floodplains. So those are the kind of restoration things we're doing in MERLIN. But we're really keen to see this not as a site-by-site issue, but put it in a landscape or a catchment context. So here's a really nice graphic where all of our cases have been put in a hypothetical catchment. And you can see, yes, there are some demonstrations that are in built-up areas where a lot of the literature that we're learning from on MBS is often to do with green-blue infrastructure and working in urban or peri-urban areas. But the coast, right up into the hills and the mountains at the headwaters. So we really want to think about how all our types of restoration measures could be. Sorry, I'm getting a signal saying my connection is unstable. I'll just reshare. There we go. So we're really trying to put everything into a landscape context. And we're doing this through what we like to think about as transformation. I'm going to speak about what transformation is and why we need it before I get into talking about the sectors. So I think this won't be new to anyone listening, that we realize that change is needed. We're seeing the impacts of multiple crises, climate crises, and here is just a screenshot from European Investment Bank talking about people's perceptions of climate change and how it affects their lives. And here we have another screen grab from Earthwatch, just talking about the degradation of biodiversity. So I think people who are interested in projects like MERLIN, they're well aware that we have these kind of climate and biodiversity crises. But part of our approach to transformation is to think about the socio-political aspects. And so we're also thinking about how you have these issues of potential social unrest associated with climate and environmental crises, and the choices we're making about how we respond to those crises. even to the extent that some people are suggesting that the environment is becoming amplified into some kind of culture war. The image is of Dutch and German farmers meeting to protest what they see as punitive climate change actions to mitigate greenhouse gases. So that's the context of why transformation might be needed, but also reminding us that not everyone agrees with the way transformations might go into place. And in our project, we're working with this framework that's under development. And I'll talk you through it. Don't worry if there's lots of writing that you perhaps can't see clearly. Particularly, I think someone was joining on an iPhone, might not be able to see it at all. But my colleague Esther Carmen and Al Hassan Ibrahim, I think Hassan's on the call, are developing this transformation framework. And there's kind of some key points to it. First of all, we believe that we're currently in an untenable system. Our ecosystems are deteriorating and they're not being valued for what they provide to us. We don't necessarily mean valued in an economic, monetary value, but just we don't protect them sufficiently given how valuable they are to human well-being. And we want to move to the right side. We want to have a transformed system where practices are being implemented as nature-based solutions and they're being implemented by all economic sectors. So that's the first thing to do with transformation. You go from one state to a new state. And we believe there are different aspects to this transformation. There are practical aspects, personal aspects, and political aspects. And the way you want to transform them is by creating new ways of doing things, maintaining where we have good practice, and disrupting things that are keeping us in an untenable system. And what's really nice is this maps on very well to the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions. And I'll speak to that standard in just a moment. But it's really about there are practical things we can be changing. There are social and ways we see the world that we can change. And there are issues to do with the politics and the way we manage our social networks and institutions that we can change. And we do this through stages. It doesn't happen overnight. First of all, you have triggers for change. Things are getting worse and people are collecting knowledge about problems. But in order to change from problems to solutions, you need to actually start putting together your networks. You need to have more solution-oriented knowledge. You need to start having standards, political will, and actions. You then have to implement them, and finally it becomes institutionalized. And I will say now that we think in our journey, even within another 2 years, we'll probably still be in the preparing and navigating the change stage of our journey. I don't think we will get to institutionalization at all in the next 2 years, but we're definitely trying to move along this journey. So that's when we talk about transformation with our economic sectors, that's the journey we're going on. And we do this by working with standards and with visions. So the standards I mentioned, the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions. And we found this very, very useful. This became apparent to us when we were developing our proposal. I'd like to thank our colleagues at WWF for bringing this to our attention. And it's 8 thematic criteria that says to call something a nature-based solution, it has to meet these different criteria. It has to be associated with societal challenges, not just a single issue like conservation of freshwater species, but actually doing things that are beneficial for human well-being and has direct biodiversity benefits. And you do it in a way where you're protecting ecosystems, you're making sure that you're connecting different sectors and different scales, you're thinking about infrastructure, management, and restoration. But we're doing this guided by the vision that's in the European Green Deal, which is all about mitigating climate change, leaving no one behind, restoring our ecosystems, but doing it in a way that maps across multiple domains, sectors, and policies in a very coherent vision for the future. So finally, we turn to our economic sectors, and then we can tell you what we're doing. So in MERLIN, we work with 6: agriculture, hydropower, insurance, mainly natural catastrophe insurance, but also there is life insurance. And I think Audrey is here on the call. She can perhaps chip in later if need to. inland navigation, peat extraction, and water supply and sanitation. And as I said before, we're trying to think about these sectors, how they work across all of Europe, and how their practices can be related to what we're doing in MERLIN, which is good practice in freshwater restoration and nature-based solutions. And one thing that I would say that we've done in MERLIN, which has been really, really important, is as well as having excellent implementation partners and research partners, we also have what's been labeled our sectoral partners. So we have members within the consortium who are connected to their sector. So we have Natureland for agriculture, we have Suka, which is the Finnish Environment Institute, helping us with hydropower, a Catalyst, working on insurance, BFG, a German research institute who represent an international association called PIANC for inland navigation, and also Zoltaras, helping us with navigation, the International Peatland Society for the peat extraction sector, and Aqua Publica Europa for the water supply and sanitation sector. And these are really important because they help us connect with the sector, find individuals representing associations. They understand the sector and they're able to teach us about the sector and help us make sure that what we're talking about is relevant and credible and kind of tapping into the key issues for the sectors involved. So really important boundary mediators between the researchers and the sectors themselves. So like I said, some of the transformation thinking is really flipping challenges to solutions. And if I just go back to this, I don't know who's in the audience today, but before I started MERLIN, I might have looked at this diagram and thought, well, these are sectors that perhaps are causing pressures on freshwater restoration. You know, agriculture with a perhaps over abstracting in certain areas, creating problems with ecological flow, or putting too much nutrient into our waterways, or inland navigation with the shift under the Green Deal to more inland freight transport. We're having bigger ships, deeper drafts requiring more water, more engineering of fairways. These are things that are putting pressure on our freshwaters and requiring restoration. So they're kind of the problem. I don't know if you think that or not, but that's how perhaps I might have thought about it 10 years ago. And now in MERLIN, along with many others, we're trying to flip this problem-orientated thinking into a solutions-orientated thinking. And this is why I really like the idea of nature-based solutions. I've put the UNEP definition up here, which you can read for yourselves, but really thinking about saying, okay, these sectors can be a pressure on our environment, or they could be sectors that are vulnerable to environmental change. But also we hear from representatives of these sectors that they want to be seen as stewards for the environment. So let's take them at that word and say, what can you do within your sector to mainstream good practice? And so flipping from being a challenge, being a pressure, being a problem, to being part of the solution. That's the thinking. So we're doing this working with representatives of these 6 sectors, but also working with some of the MERLIN case studies. So taking from the 18 a selected set where we see a connection to some of our sectors. So for example, down at the bottom left, we have 13. That's a Soraya case study where they're looking at working with the agricultural sector in quite intensely irrigated areas. How can they get farmers to make more space for nature? Right up in the top right, if you like, number 14, that's the Compasau case study in Finland, where they're working with a past peat extraction site and saying, okay, how can we really restore this, not just re-wet it a little bit, but actually have functioning ecosystems being built up. So we're working with these case studies and with the sectors to create what we call a community of practice. And that is bringing together people with a common purpose, a common interest around a domain, to share knowledge, build mutual understanding, but beyond that, build actionable knowledge, build new practice or improved practice that will change things on the ground. And we're doing that through some, conventional desktop reviews. What can we learn about what's going on in these sectors in different places around the world? Questionnaires about people's perceptions and views on nature-based solutions, what works, what doesn't. Interviews and roundtables, which is bringing people together online in this post-COVID era. We're not flying around the world anymore to speak to each other. We're meeting online. And we're having presentations, discussions, and debates about what we could do and what is being done already. And this has already generated some snapshot reports of what the sectors think. And if you're interested, you can see the deliverable on the MERLIN website. But these roundtables are really been about trying to develop cooperation points or low-hanging fruits. What is the area within the MERLIN project that MERLIN researchers can work with these representatives of the sectors to actually do something new, create something new, disrupt something that wasn't working well, or maintain good practice? So I'm going to go through this in more detail in the next 6 slides, but basically we have some low-hanging fruits or some cooperation points that we're trying to develop for each of the sectors. And I will go through each of these now in turn. You can see at the bottom, before I explain, you'll see a little face pop up at the bottom of each slide. That's just to remind me, to remind you that behind each sector is a whole team of researchers who've been working hard to build this community of practice. On this slide, you can see GESA. So you can see on each slide that the current lead for each sectoral team, but there is a number of different people working together. So the agricultural sector, they met, their roundtable was in June, and they talked about some presentations that were showing different kinds of nature-based solutions that you can do on farm. And here you have an example of a kind of really developed buffer strip with all sorts of benefits for water quantity and water quality for the farmer and for the freshwater environment. Also in a micro catchment area and the floodplain. We had panel discussions, group discussions, and really where this community of practice is really developing their ideas is around how they can show the benefits for farmers, how they can show where CAP has potential policy instruments to support this on-farm micro or floodplain level MBS, and perhaps get them more concretely implemented in further rounds of CAP strategic plans. Issues to think about value chains and really bringing up this issue of expertise as a bottleneck and the need to have more advice to farmers about MBS and how they can be implemented as part of their farming enterprise. So in Hydropower, led by my colleague Esther Carmen and many others, that's really looking at how the hydropower sector could help to remove barriers and deliver nature-based solutions by allowing free-flowing waters. So in the second roundtable, the first roundtable, they spent a lot of time discussing kind of how the sector worked. In the second roundtable, they were thinking about 3 things. First of all, how the sector could contribute to removing any kind of barrier, because we know that hydropower barriers are quite a small proportion of the total barriers in our rivers in Europe, but they can be part of the drive to remove obsolete barriers, not necessarily to do with hydropower. We also talked about barriers that were linked directly to energy kind of production, and finally how we could fund that and how we could do that in a cross-sectoral way. So what was really positive is the sector are willing to think about removal of obsolete barriers, but we need to really understand better what makes something obsolete or not, and have some tools that can actually prioritize which barriers should be removed and the different financial, ecological, and social factors. So by the second roundtable, they've kind of got quite a strong cooperation point to work around to take further in the next 2 years. Insurance, led by our colleague Audrey here, they talked mainly about the regulatory and policy framework that could help the insurance sector actually contribute to nature restoration. And a lot of this is around data sharing and using evidence, but also the need for the industry to have really strong metrics expressed in the way that they understand, like rate of return or net present value, so that they can link this with actually trying to calculate how MBS might reduce risk and how they can translate that into their products. And this sector is working nicely with two of our case studies, one in Spain and one in Romania. In the navigation sector, they're really thinking about what navigation stakeholders understand by MBS and how they think it might relate to them. And this has been quite an interesting and challenging process, working mainly with EU-wide and international river commissions. So the sector is saying that they want stable water levels, and they don't mind whether it's a grey or a nature-based solution that can improve fairway conditions in low water. So they're open to nature-based solutions, but they need to know a little bit more about how it will work in different geographies, and they need to know how it will work with different political configurations. So they need a case-by-case solution. I think it's also quite clear that while there are some guidance and guidelines, there needs to be more training about what MBS can mean for the sector and how it can be part of an integrated solution or project. So they're working hard, and actually we haven't got the case studies on here, but they are working with case studies in the Danube to develop this further. The peat extraction sector, led by my colleague Hassan, they've been looking at how they can get after-use plans for old peat extraction sites to really have more focus on rewetting and revegetation, and to think about this at the landscape scale. So if I work around this figure, one of the cooperation points is to get those managing the after use. It might be the peat extraction company, or it might be the landowners that the peat extraction company leased the land from, is to think about what they're doing on that site in the landscape level. So going beyond the site to thinking about how whatever they do to the hydrology of that site will affect adjoining land. And this can be quite difficult because there's often very different land uses and ownership conditions around the peat extraction site. This led on to a discussion about maybe needing policy change, maybe needing to be clear about policy property rights and who has the obligation for these after-use plans, and also the fact that different member states have very different approaches to licensing peat extraction and the requirements for after-use plans. They then talked about funding and finance, needing a clear business case, and how this can be done through incentives, perhaps thinking about under climate law and the obligation for land use and land use change and forestry, mitigation targets and how there are cap incentives to do with that, but also perhaps carbon credits. And this takes us back to the fact that there needs to be cross-sectoral cooperation here for comprehensive after-use plans, and maybe the peat extraction sector should be seen as a partner in wider catchment partnerships. And then last but not least, water supply and sanitation sector, which was really thinking about working upstream. I mean, there's a lot of really good MBS going on in this sector associated with wastewater treatment and alternative ways of doing that, moving away from grey wastewater treatment to nature-based solutions like with reed beds, etc. But in MERLIN, we're really interested in how this sector can work together with others to really treat and protect drinking water at source by making sure that upstream drinking water sources are being managed in a way that are clean and stable and available all year round. And they're doing this in discussion with some of our cases in the Danube and in the Forth in Scotland. And again, this sector is looking for metrics on costs and benefits, comparing MBS for grey solutions, how they can attract funding. But really, and this is the cooperation point for our work, is how they can be involved in partnerships upstream to work with public authorities and land managers. So just to recap, that's 6 sectors where we've identified different cooperation points where we want to work with the sectors in MERLIN. And so I want to come back again to this idea that this is about mainstreaming catchment thinking. This is not about taking individual sectors and individual sites, but saying how can we connect all of these thinkings, these different communities of practice, these different aspects they might want to create or mainstream or disrupt, but think about them in a catchment together, working together. So beyond having the six sectoral, individual six sector communities of practice, we're also trying to develop thinking around a cross-sectoral community of practice where we start to understand their interdependencies. And this is a diagram that myself, Ava, and Anna, both working for WWF, came up with about a year ago. So we're doing more thinking and we're going to update it, but this was our thinking before. That actually our six sectors kind of divide, if you like, into two halves. So on the left-hand side, you have sectors where they clearly are being asked to do something themselves on their own lands or with their own assets. So the agricultural sector, the peat extraction sector, the hydropower sector. They're being asked to implement measures like revegetation, connecting floodplains, removing barriers. And they sometimes might resist these asks, but they are being asked to be active actors in implementing nature-based solutions. Whereas at least about a year ago, we felt that the inland navigation, insurance and water supply sectors, they would benefit from these other sectors doing these MBS, but they weren't actively perhaps engaged in doing MBS themselves. Although we are now looking at how the insurance sector are actually getting involved potentially with insuring NBS, particularly in terms of agricultural insurance and how that could reflect if farms start to bring these on-farm microcatchment and floodplain level MBS, whether that would affect the agricultural insurance premiums and perhaps reduce them. So we are trying to build these connections, but we're really trying to say, okay, some of these sectors are very clearly involved, others are maybe slightly more indirect relationship. And so how we recognize these interdependencies, and perhaps we have to work with these different sectors slightly differently because of those different relationships. So in terms of what we're doing next, we've done our first roundtable. We've identified our cooperation points, had a second roundtable, and now we're working on these sectoral transformation strategies, one per sector, which will be peer reviewed, peer checked and deliberated on in our third roundtable. But we want to get to the end with sectoral strategies that say, okay, what can be transformed in each sector to get us to mainstreaming freshwater nature-based solutions by 2030. But we also, as I've been saying, we want to make this a cross-sectoral thinking as well. We want to create a route map where we bring together the different sectoral strategies into one route map together. And we'll do that also by supplementing the sectoral work with the cross-sectoral roundtable, which we will hold next year, work on value chains, policy analysis, and just transition. We've literally just submitted the policy deliverable last week. If you're interested, it will be on our website in the next couple of weeks. And I want to say that this isn't just procedural. It's not just thinking about getting people together once a year. It's actually thinking about this as a set of nested governance interactions where we are relevant and working with the rest of the MERLIN project. So we're working in EU and member state, that kind of top-down slide I showed at the very beginning. We've been talking mainly with EU level or perhaps national sectoral associations, EU and member state policy administration individuals. But we are very aware that if we want to see this transformation, these sectors will also be working with public, private, and third sector organized stakeholders and drawing on what is being done at regional and case study sites. And so very much whatever we decide to do as our kind of community of practice for each sector and cross-sectorally, we will be needing to do that in parallel and increasingly in synergy with what's being discussed with our case study sites. So just wanted to make that clear that we're not totally disconnected from the local level, that we want to try and build in this idea of nested governance sites. So I'm just about to finish to let people ask some questions and discuss some stuff. I just wanted to say, where have we got to? My personal reflection is that transformation needs to be real. So it's been really important to map what we're doing in our sectors onto real cases and onto real policies. It's involved working across a lot of boundaries, which is hugely challenging. And for many of us, not just me, people in the communities of practice, they're being introduced to new topics, new networks, new relationships, which I think is positive, but can be quite challenging as well. We're aware that we're using MBS, which is a buzzword, and we need to be very careful that we don't get caught up in a hype disappointment cycle. That's why we like the IUCN standard, because it's actually quite rigorous about what you can and can't call an MBS. And that brings me on to my slightly more critical social science reflection, that we're really trying to use this very positive framing about cooperation, about finding common practice, finding common goals. But I think I need to be honest and say there's also power dynamics going on here. In order to get these sectors to participate in MERLIN, we have to do things that are relevant and salient to them. But on the other hand, we have people, and we have a lot of debate about this within our work package and wider, that we have limits on how much cooperation we can have if we feel that we're being asked to perhaps promote practices that are not sustainable or not in keeping with freshwater restoration. And in these roundtables and in other interactions, all individuals can use knowledge strategically. We can highlight evidence that is positive for the way we frame the world. We can not take on board evidence that is not good for the way we see the world. And there's a lot of contestation. We've had a lot of debates about these cooperation points, what they should be, whether they're fair. And sometimes the sectors would have preferred us to look at other aspects, like the peat extraction sector would have preferred us to look at issues to do with how difficult it is to substitute peat for another kind of material in the horticultural value chain, for example. Or the hydropower sector wanted us to look at sustainable refurbishment of hydropower assets rather than asking them to remove them. So there's been a lot of contestation and discussion before we could even get to these cooperation points. And I'm sure that will continue. So I think it's been hugely fruitful for us to work with these sectors. We're very grateful to our case study and sectoral partners for teaching us and helping us and holding our hand in this relationship and network building. But it's not easy. And I think we've got plenty of challenges ahead as we try to get to our route map by the end of 2025. And now I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kirsty, for this very clear and very nice presentation. So I've heard a little bit of it already last week. I found very many new things, so I'm very grateful and thankful for this talk. Okay, and now we haven't got any questions in the chat, but we have enough time to discuss things. So whoever wants to ask a question or discuss something with Kirsty, just unmute yourself or use the tool. Seemingly everything was very clear. Everyone knows what you are doing and where we are heading to.
I'm sorry, I would interrupt it. I have only been able to just join. I was held up. I was so I'm not gonna ask any questions because that would mean repeat the whole webinar. But is it going to be put on the recording?
It is recorded and it will be on our website after the 16th of October.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Welcome. So, Phyllis, your turn to ask a question.
Yeah, I thought that Kirsty's information was wonderful and very helpful and comprehensive. Just wondering how I'm a partner in another Horizon Europe project on freshwater restoration, Eco Advance, and I'm just wondering how you see balancing the variety of requirements that are simultaneously but yet sequential for freshwater restoration, for a whole other variety of needs for new funding sources and energy. I don't mean energy from the point of view of electricity. I meant from the point of view of human energy to kind of balance all of those. Can you talk a little bit about that? Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. Sounds like you know exactly what you're talking about. I think that's probably where I probably should say more about this idea of cooperation points. I mean, on the one hand, a community of practice, it is about finding a common theme, an area that a practice that you want to work around. But I think it was in response to what you're suggesting about these kind of can feel quite overwhelming, all these different things you need to think about. And if we have any of our case study partners, they're possibly nodding. In MERLIN, we've been very ambitious in that we're asking people not only to do, restoration for conservation of a habitat or species, we're asking to think about restoration as a nature-based solution, which means, as you say, balancing a whole range of societal issues, challenges. We're asking them to involve not just the immediate apparent stakeholders, but all affected stakeholders and those that can affect what they're doing, and not just at the site, but also in a regional context to work with the different policies. And, in MERLIN, everyone's pretty well funded. It's part of the joy of winning this project. But if we think about taking this upper scale to mainstream across the whole of Europe, there's a huge financing and funding gap. I think my colleague Sien is here. She can talk more to that. So we have another part of the project looking at different financing and funding options. So there is a lot going on at one time. And as you say, that can feel very overwhelming. And I think one part of the transformation, transformations are not easy. I was going to say more about that. It is quite challenging. So not to lose people by just asking them to do everything all at once was the reason we chose this idea of cooperation points. And then from choosing something very concrete and precise and specific that we could work on together, we could then say, okay, how do you manage the trade-offs? How do you win the funding or financing that you need to do? How can we start to work on an action plan? But I have to say that's the philosophy. We're just at that point where we've managed to identify the cooperation point, and now we have to bring together these different requirements. But to keep energy, I think we need to keep it tractable and keep it as something that is possible to do, because it's very quick to lose people by asking them to do too much too fast and all at once. So yeah, cooperation points, then where can we do it? What evidence do we need and how can we pay for it? That would be my order.
I hope it's okay to just follow up with one aspect, and that's the governance aspect. Here we are telling people to look at the Water Framework Directive, create plans, basin plans, et cetera, and at the same time, we're looking at other initiatives that aren't necessarily correlated and sometimes can be distracting or whatever. How do you see the next, say, 3 years of trying to achieve significant planning and governance development opportunities in the context of the Water Framework Directive while we're doing these other cooperation points and other freshwater restoration activities?
That's a really interesting question because we've just finished a policy deliverable. And in that, we focused on 4 kind of key policies, the climate law, adaptation strategy, Water Framework Directive, and Common Agricultural Policy. And they all share the fact that member states have to make plans. And in fact, if a nature restoration law is adopted, they will also have to make nature restoration plans. So one of our key findings is, can we be smart about how we use these strategic plans? How can we make these plans coherent with one another so that when we're asking people to do things on the ground, it is done with this kind of coherent, all the plans are pulling in one direction rather than, as you say, these different initiatives and plans all kind of coming at each other. And can we make sure that there's good resourcing in terms of both money and capacity expertise, literally time and energy to do it. So that's a partial answer to your question, Phyllis, is I'm a real fan of trying to practice policy coherence and doing that at the planning process, which is not just about creating a plan, but creating these governance networks of sharing knowledge and capacity.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Phyllis, for the question. Thank you, Kirsty, for the answer. So there is someone who is writing in the chat. Curtis, would you want to talk, or shall I read the question?
I could read it, or basically my question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
So I'm here in North Carolina. We were working on developing some of the largest peat farms in the U.S. on private lands. These are former drain lands for agriculture, a couple for peat extraction. So the question I have really is, it was mentioned that peat extraction community wanted to focus on the fact that peat is hard to replace, which it is in the horticultural business. I'm working with a Canadian IPS and the US IPS. And it seems that, and I've been trying to convince that group that, in fact, the restoration part of it really needs to be focused to offset some of the effects of this peat extraction. I mean, I realize some people want to totally stop peat extraction, but when you look at, for example, Canada, they use about 0.0001% of the land, and they're pretty much ahead of the game in terms of restoring these areas. We are doing it on the basis that we're selling carbon credits on these drain peatlands that we re-wet. This should help pay for the biodiversity. It seems to me this is an NBS solution on this side of the pond, as they say.
I'll start responding, but if my colleague Hassan is still on the call and wants to respond, he leads on the peat extraction. I totally agree with you. We have other colleagues looking at carbon credits as a financing option from a consultancy called Connectology. But we have had these discussions about how can we see restoration of peat extraction sites as a way of sequestering carbon that could be, well, either counted towards national contributions, emission contributions. So in 2026 in the Europe, wetlands and peatlands will be a category in how we account for sequestration of carbon in those wetlands and peatlands. And there is a bit of a debate about how peat extraction sites will be considered. I'm not an expert at all, but there is a debate about how we can make it visible. It may be quite a small area, but it's a very intensive use of that area in terms of how greenhouse gases are emitted. And then how can you set up a market that actually allows good practice in restoration and re-wetting to be rewarded by the market? So that's an ongoing debate. We don't have the answer yet, but my thinking was the same as yours, as that's a good, line of thinking to pursue. Hassan, go ahead.
Yes. So yeah, I agree with your concern, and the main issue has been that, well, they argue it has been difficult to restore, but then not that they are unwilling. It's not that they are unwilling to contribute, but then how that can be funded. And so they have also suggested a few ways to do that, more like they are much more interested in the public funding approaches. Yeah. So the main thing also is not because they don't want to, they want to create an offset, but they want to, how they will stay in business. So that whenever we do, if we are mainstreaming NBS or we are doing restoration peat extraction, they wouldn't be pushed back. However, they also have this argument that it's not everywhere that restoration can be taking place. So even if we are thinking about doing NBS to do the offset, they think about, well, different countries have different approaches or different land use conditions and land ownership types. So how don't we then combine with other land uses, or something like doing wind farming, or doing forestry and those kind of things? Yeah. So these are some of the suggestions. Generally, they are bringing forth. Yeah. And the other part, when talking about doing restoration, some of them cited examples in some countries where you do extraction. For every piece of land that you extract, you have to restore an extra peatland somewhere else, not necessarily at the very same place, but then somewhere else. So let's say you do restoration on 1 acre of peatland, then you do extraction on 1 acre of peatland, then restore 2 acres of peatland somewhere to offset that. Yeah, so that has been the argument. But of course, some people also who are environmental focused are thinking like, well, we are saying someone should do destroy the land and then provide a solution somewhere. So we are in the balance now. We haven't really decided yet, but we are looking at that kind of trade-off. Yeah, whether, well, they can continue with the extraction, and then what is the best restoration approach that will make it like lead to biodiversity, but also help with the other challenges like food. They're talking about doing horticulture and not really. Sorry, I'm a bit lost here, but if we are to promote restoration, they might horticulture or having that peat product to use in horticulture may be challenging. That's their argument. Yeah. So how best? What should be the product to do to replace like peat-based product in horticulture? That is it. So we need to provide that solution, and at the same time also ensure how they can stay in business. So these are the concerns that they are raising.
Thank you, Hassan. Thank you, Kirsty. I hope you are satisfied. Curtis?
Yes, I mean, I think it's an interesting balance between how you extract and what restoration. And I guess I also represent the U.S. IPS now, and I'm trying to get them to work with the international IPS to basically focus more on the restoration part as a part of a natural solution, and not, as I say, for example, the U.S. buys more peat than anyone. We buy 1 million tons a year from Canada. It's a lot of peat that's used for horticulture in little bags. So we really need to look at that. But I think the carbon market is coming on strong privately in the U.S., and it will be a big part of the solution, not only for agriculture, which is the other sector which has drained more than half of our peatlands in the U.S. So that's another big part of the restoration it's going to be done through the carbon market. So it's something that's, I think, exciting and moving forward with an NBS solution. Thank you.
If there's no question, I just want to add one thing. When you mentioned the carbon market, yes, that has been one of the discussions that we had, and is their main concern is being really clear about who own those kind of the carbon that is sequestrated, and if we can establish that kind of boundary for like you do restoration here, there's carbon benefit, but then is it going to maybe go expand beyond that site, and who is going to own that, and who is going to account for that? And one of the questions also that they raise is if we can really understand or establish this thing we're talking about, net zero, and what it really means to the sector, and if they really understand the benefit that they would gain from it.
Thanks, Hassan, for this further information. So is there any more question for Kirsty or Hassan or anyone else from the team? If not, I want to close this webinar with the announcement of the next webinar. The next webinar will be on the 6th of November, and it will be held by Stephen Hart from the European Investment Bank. And it will be something about investing in nature-based solutions. So we will advertise it again on social media, or you can also find it on our website. Hope you will join again. And with that, I really want to thank once again Kirsty for this very nice talk. And I want to thank you for attending this webinar. Have a nice remaining afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Astrid. Thank you, everyone, for listening.